I'm here with Jake. You know him from Hazard Class. We're trying something new.
A new thing. Yeah. A third guy, if you will.
Yeah. So what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about common exposure levels.
Explaining the industrial hygienist and maybe how it applies to them.
And we're going to talk about how a hazardous materials technician might use them on scene as well.
Let's take a listen. Hey, Jake, you know what the worst part about arriving at a hazmat scene is?
Besides the fact that my hair looks like a rat's nest.
Much like Mike's, yeah, but also uncertainty. You don't have any idea what's in the air.
And assuming it's just chemicals is not going to cut it. We need some answers, fast.
Right. That's where the Explorer comes in. Just real-time chemical ID and quantification right in the field.
Not just, yeah, that's something pretty bad. It tells you exactly what's there and how much.
So you can set up your safety zones like an adult and not a rookie just guessing where to put the tape.
Defensible, quantitative data in seconds, making decision-making a hell of a lot easier.
So no more waiting around for an answer, just solid life-saving intel.
Check out the Explorer IR and stop guessing. Check out 908devices.com. You know what stresses me out on hazmat calls?
The part where everybody stands around saying, it smells like burnt feet.
Exactly. Guessing is not a tactic.
Yeah, so Teledyne FLIR Defense builds detection tools, so we stopped doing that. Real sensors for real CBRNE threats.
They've been at it for over 30 years, helping first responders actually know what they're dealing with.
They do hazmat, homeland security, public safety. They take ugly scenes and they make it into clear answers.
The more you know, the smarter you operate.
So check out Teledyne FLIR Defense, any threat, anywhere, without the mystery.
We promise you would look in. We promised that we would look into a solution for battery fires. And many companies have presented their products to us. This one is noteworthy because it extinguishes lithium-ion battery fires. It works on multiple classes of fires, prevents fires from spreading, and lithium-ion batteries from reigniting.
And before that keyboard warrior starts cap locking, asking for proof, the links are in the show notes below for UL Class A and B, as well as the BSI for 10 categories, including lithium-ion batteries.
We have put it through our field tests, and we were impressed with the result, but now we suggest that you do your own myth busting. It's available in various options to integrate into your current process. You can access it by checking out Fire Suppression Solutions or clicking the link in the show notes.
Here we are. Big old Jake is with me.
The time is now.
Yeah, Mike has a wider screen. It's all right. Not because he's larger. I don't know. But
It's okay.
we have taken the bold move of saying we're going to start subbing in guys that are still in the field. We know we've been kind of out of the field a little bit, and we want to bring in guys that are still reacting and doing things and responding. So we brought Jake in because he's one of us.
Yeah. I'm somewhat in the field, I would say. I technically am employed.
Yeah. Yeah. So the conversation is going to continue like we do. And instead of it being me and Mike, it's going to be maybe Mike and Jake or me and Mike or whoever it might be. But we're going to try to mix it up a little bit more. We think about after 540 episodes or whatever the hell it is, it's you've heard a lot of what we have to say about hazmat. So we're going to start bringing in outside people, and hopefully you guys like it. We'll try it out.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about today is those levels of exposure that maybe you're comfortable with, maybe you're not comfortable with. And Agils were, how do you say it, Eagles?
I say eagle, and I think that might be the Mike in me being a little dyslexic, but it looks like when I learned it, I heard eagle, even though it's obviously not eagle when you look at the word, but Agil feels appropriate. Is that how you learned it?
Yeah, I learned it as Agils, and the way I heard about it was from a guy that was like an industrial hygienist. So like, you know, that's how, as far as I know, that's how they say it. But I don't know.
I don't know. Agel, Eagle, the one that is confusing to a lot of people. That's the one we're talking about today.
Right. So, okay, let's explain them a little bit. Because I say in the response world, it's not a very prevalent term because we're typically going with some of the ones we'll go over later in the show because they're a little more comfortable is these AGELs are for airborne concentration thresholds for general public for single short-term exposures, and they go anywhere from 10 minutes to 8 hours, right? So they got 3 different levels of AGELs. They got AGEL 1, which is going to be a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of irritation, some mild reversible effects. You got level 2, which is now we're starting to talk about irreversible or serious stuff, and you have long-lasting adverse health effects or impaired ability to escape. And then level 3 is going to be your life-threatening effects or death, and they are made by the EPA for community protection.
I think the important thing to talk about in these Eagles, to confuse everyone listening, is that these are based on a population that is not a healthy workforce, right? A lot of our exposure limits that we're going to talk about are based off of like healthy young man, essentially. Right. And these are not. These take into consideration the elderly, people that are like babies, and maybe someone with asthma, stuff like that. All that information is factored into these community guidelines, not just for a safe person working in the workforce.
That's, you know what, that's a really good point, because you would think to be on the job, right, to be working and responding and stuff like that, you'd have to be in some type of shape. I know the thing says, off the top of my head, I think it's like 150-pound healthy male that's between, you know, like 25 and 40 years old. And, you know, the funny thing is you look at the firehouse and like, nope.
yeah, exactly. Not quite the demographic. It isn't the calendar models that you're told that it is going to be, right?
No,
But I think it's also important when we think about people being exposed in a potential release is, right, who are these people? It's generally not going to be the healthy workforce. It's going to be whoever the hell happens to be in the neighborhood at the time, right? And so having guidelines that are built around that population actually does serve a purpose.
Yeah. So who uses this thing?
So, I mean, oftentimes these are used by industrial hygienists. If you're going to build a factory, you have to plan, right? You have to do risk management plans, and you have to decide, well, what happens in our worst case scenarios? Where are we going to be isolating from? Where are we going to build our fences? Where are we going to, how far can we allow the nearest housing development to be built? And so an industrial hygienist takes these into consideration as they are making all those plans.
And they do what, like modeling and stuff like that?
They're going to use this in different forms of dispersion modeling. They're going to use this to make predictions as in their worst case scenarios, what kind of concentrations they would expect to find in different locations. They're going to line that up with their Eagle 2, Eagle 3, and they're going to say, well, where are we concerned that someone might actually have health effects if we have a release?
Right.
And that's when they're going to develop shelter-in-place triggers, things like where are our plans for emergency releases? What happens?
Right. Well, and then you contrast that with something like us, right? Responders coming in, right? Where let's say we have a chlorine tank, at a warehouse or something like that, right? At this point, for us, the group, we're going to plug in like gas detectors, right? The G-pop doesn't have that, so the analyzation of the industrial hygienist is kind of taking that whole metering thing out. And so we can put in our gas detector stuff from like Cameo or Aloha. We can map in the AGEL 2s and 3s. We can set the hot zone based on the hot AGEL 3, right? And then evacuation versus shelter in place is now kind of an easy thing to do because you understand the footprints. And so when you have the API model, the analyze, plan, implement, evaluate, that's the other one. We analyze it based upon the AGELs. We plan based upon those action decisions, right? We implement it with the evacuation or shelter in place, and then we could remonitor.
Yeah, and it's you see a plume model, and like without something to leverage it against, you just have a pretty picture, right? So that's where these come in and actually make those zones inside of those plume modeling softwares matter, right? And how do we make them actionable in the field, right? And we take those, we think about these protective action criteria, and we have our pack 1, our pack 2, our pack 3, and this is just a growing scale where this might be something that we smell. Now, all of a sudden, it's going to start having serious health effects once we get into pack 2. Once we get into pack 3, now we're actually thinking about life-threatening implications if someone's exposed at this level.
You know what, pack? I'm not very familiar before we started researching this thing out because, again, this is almost like a multiplier, I'm thinking, on the Agils, where it does other things. But let's say we have a specialty solvent, a very boutique grass-fed solvent. It's something that's very, very boutique. And we can take, as the industrial hygienist, use the pack 2 as the trigger point for an evacuation. If it's less than pack 2, we don't have to trigger, we can shelter in place. But this combination sets guide points or alarm points in a fixed gas detection scenario.
And then when you overlay that into what we do on the hazmat tech side, right now we're coming into an unknown, and we're going to use these pack values inside of our plume modeling, inside of our zones that we're setting up to immediately allow people inside of our system to know what level we're at. We're going to be able to come in and say, we're above pack 2, and then they're going to know what that means, and now we can all get on the same page a lot faster than if we were to have to break down these things into a little bit more detail.
I like that. And one other term which I was not familiar. Again, these are not in the response world. As far as I know, they're not in the response world. I never used these things. Did you ever use them?
I know of them, and it's to me it was always that thing on the bottom of the Cameo chemical guide that you said. Those are for something, but and you kind of stumble on them. But they do have a good purpose, and they allow us to make actionable information from, especially things like plume modeling and stuff like that, right?
I always thought of them as something like, when the industrial hygienist is talking to you, you go, yes.
Yeah. We all agree. I concur, right?
I concur.
Yes, yeah.
But one of those add-ons is the reference concentration, which is put out by the EPA. And their official definition is continuous inhalation exposure level likely to be without appreciable risk of adverse effects over a lifetime. So basically what they're saying is this is a chronic exposure value, and it's not for emergency use. But I've never heard this on the street.
I have not heard this one either. But it makes sense, right? Imagine you live near or you work at a refinery, and you're going to be constantly exposed to benzene, right? How do we know when we fall over that cliff to the risk values going up considerably, right? And that's how an industrial hygienist is going to use a value like this.
I like that. I like it. So, and as far as us, as I said, it's almost never used operation. It's not relevant in an emergency. It could be referenced maybe during, the after action report, like the long-term community exposure follow-ups or remediation type things. That's where you might see this.
Yeah, and so in this research work, we found another one, right? And this one I literally have never seen, right? I don't even know how you pronounce it. NAAQS, NAAQS, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And this is put out by the EPA, right? Once again, another legal definition, legally enforceable outdoor air limits for criteria pollutions, right? So that's there's specific pollutants that are included in this, right? Ozone, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, lead. But these are designed as public health limits.
Right. So maybe me as the industrial hygienist, I might have like a power plant scenario, right, with emissions and stuff like that. What I would do is I would use these things to ensure that the emissions won't cause off-site NAC exceedance, and it would, it's like, and compliance reporting. It comes down to that.
And as a tech, I mean, this is just going to frankly not be used. I mean, maybe in terms of some sort of like large wildfire event where there's acres and acres of smoke pouring over a community, and we're going to be monitoring this for an extremely long time about kind of long-term community impact. That's when we're going to think about this kind of coming into place. But this is not going to be an acute emergency at all.
Which now brings us to the things that you're probably a lot more comfortable with us. And please, this is not an exhaustive, comprehensive list of these things. These are the typical, most common parlances and how they interact with the industrial hygienist and stuff like that. And the first one, probably the most relevant and used, at least in the United States, is the PEL, right? Or the permissible exposure limit, or the TWA. And again, this comes down to, I think, just semantics. One club has one definition, the other club has another definition, because we do 410s and then I do 5/8s, and it's like, okay, great. But what this is basically, this is the 8-hour one, and it's the maximum average airborne concentration over an 8-hour workday, and it is legally enforceable by OSHA.
I think that's a really important factor in this when we think about our permissible exposure limits, because there are a bunch of different bodies that will issue these, but this is the one that is ultimately enforceable by OSHA, right? And so, when I think about these, when I teach, people will say, well, why? If you're base level hazmat tech or hazmat operator, right? Why is this even a thing, right? It's not enough to just say, that area is bad, right? I have my meter and it can give me a number, but what does that number mean? Now I can start to make my number actually matter, right? So now when I take my meter into an area, I take my monitor into an area, now I can actually compare that to how I expect it to affect me from a health perspective for all these different various things, right? So if you think someone working in industry, right? An industrial hygienist, they know that Bob in the muffler shop has to be exposed to a certain amount of CO on a daily basis because there's cars coming in and cars going out. And so how do we know that Bob working in the muffler shop isn't going to be exposed to too much carbon monoxide in a day that he's going to have an increased risk of long-term health effects, right? And so that's where this value comes in.
I like it, and it's one of the more useful in my world. The PEL equals SCBA, right? That was my trigger point to say I have to put on my respiratory protection on this thing. So I think it is used in emergency responses because that is the trigger point for SCBA to go on. This is now not a thing to a thing, and we could use it for extended operations, right? We could use it for decon. And that, because if we're below that threshold, then do you need SCBA? I would think not.
No.
But before that, today's episode is brought to you by Rigaku Analytical Devices, which are the folks who have been perfecting 1064 nanometer Raman probably longer than some of you guys have been doing hazmat.
They just launched their 4th generation handheld analyzer, the Icon X, built specifically for real-world stuff hazmat teams deal with every day. We're talking dirty powders, mixed materials, dyes, colors, all the things that make other instruments throw a tantrum.
And the 1064 nanometer laser means that reduced fluorescence. So what you get is fast, reliable chemical ID in under a minute instead of staring at that blank screen wondering what went wrong.
And this new platform isn't just an upgrade, it's a whole toolbox. It supports new accessories, including standoff analysis, so you can get answers without getting too close.
Yeah, so if you want an analyzer that's been evolving right alongside the hazmat world, check out Rigaku's newest Raman at rigakuanalytical.com. You know what I love about the city?
The protesters blocking the streets?
Yes, that and the e-scooter gangs. They are great.
Oh yeah, nothing screams hazmat like a moped with a battery that's about to go nuclear.
Right, that's where Obexian FR saves the day.
Lightweight, mobile friendly, and designed for first responders because the last thing we need is extra weight when things are heating up.
And it's third-party tested to lower the toxic gases below IDLH levels.
So you can actually breathe while you're putting the scooter fighter out.
And if you need more, Obexian FR comes by the pallet or in certified poly drum kits.
Perfect for when you think, yeah, we're going to need a lot of this.
So protect your team and your lungs, and go to see this at thehazmatguys.dgeo.com. That's thehazmatguys.dgeo.com. So let's get into the next one, the PEL Stel.
So now we're stepping away from a more chronic, not quite chronic, but more chronic exposure, thinking about 8 hours. Now we're going to step into a short-term exposure limit, our STEL, which is a 15-minute window, right? So that it's an average concentration over a 15-minute window. So we need to be below that level more than we are above it on average in a 15-minute sliding window throughout the day, right? This is going to be a measure of acute exposure.
Right. And we, as an industrial hygienist, if I was playing that, let's say we have we're cleaning out a solvent tank or something like that. What I would do is this would be the peak for the 15-minute task. At that point, I would rotate a worker to prevent the STL exceedance. Now, before we get into the hazmat responder, I feel that this is much more in line with what we do because there's scenes that take us a couple of hours to clear, but I will say the vast majority of the operations, we're in and out in 15 to 20 minutes.
Yeah, and I mean, let's just be realistic, right? If you're wearing an SCBA, right, you are, and best case scenario, maybe have 45 minutes. You certainly don't have 8 hours. Yeah, right. So this is a much more usable time frame in terms of what we would expect to be exposed to while we're working, right? And so when we think about this, we can think about how long are we going to be inside the warm zone, and then also making plans for our SCBA air management. If we're going to be going in, how long are we going to be staying in, making sure that we can get out before we would have some sort of air emergency.
Yeah. Now, another one is the PEL ceiling, right? Which the ceiling is the top, right? So this is the concentration that must never be exceeded at any time. As a industrial hygienist, I could use this for things like maybe like chlorine, right? Irritant gases. Now, if I have reached this thing, that means the instantaneous reading exceeds the ceiling, which means you need to take immediate corrective action at this point.
Yeah, and this one is really something that's different than the others. The other ones are a sliding scale throughout the day, right? We're going to be under more than we're over, while this is a hard line. We don't go over this. And this can be useful for us hazmat responders in terms of setting alarm limits, right? We can have this so that our high alarm is set so that we know when we've hit this limit, and now we know that it's time to take immediate action and withdraw.
I like that. The PEL peak. You think that was a ceiling? I'm going to smash it right now. It's not true. Well, it kind of is. The peak actually is the maximum allowable peak above the ceiling, but for a limited duration and frequency. Now, I will say this has been largely removed from the books, and I don't think the current curriculum actually addresses this one. I've never really used it.
I've never heard of this one even in peak. And I think this is, from an industrial hygienist perspective, this is a mostly historical thing. Like we've mostly moved past this, but it is, if you see it, at least you know what it is now.
Yeah.
Right?
And even in hazmat land, if you're responding, I don't think it's going to be in any field operations. So just so you when you get on scene and somebody goes, what about the PEL peak? And you go, I've heard.
And then you say, shut up, nerd.
Yes.
Yeah. No. So those are our OSHA guidelines. Now let's talk about some of the other places you could maybe be getting guidelines from, like NIOSH, right? The important one here, NIOSH guidelines are not going to be legally enforceable like the OSHA guidelines are. But the same way, the recommended exposure limit, so now we're going to, instead of calling it a permissible exposure limit, we're now going to call it a recommended exposure limit. It's an REL. We still have a time-weighted average just the same way as we did with OSHA, except for now OSHA is going to make this on the best available science to them. Once again, not legally enforceable, sometimes differ, but when they differ, you need to lean on OSHA because that's the one that could ultimately get your butt in a pinch. I
like that. And it's often more conservative than the PEL, right? The OSHA PEL. And the industrial hygienist, if I was playing that part, they might say, I'm going to go with the REL instead of the PEL to increase worker protections or, liability, because in the world of industry, that is a real thing. So
Yeah, I always say when in doubt, if the recommendation from any of these agencies is lower, use the lower one. That's going to be more safe. But ultimately, if OSHA's the lowest, that's the one you have to use because that's the one that's going to get you in trouble if you don't abide by it. But in hazmat world, once again, this is kind of a limited use case because we're not often interacting with these things for such a long period as an 8 hour. If we're thinking about PPE selection for someone that might be doing some recovery operations, maybe that's a case longer term. But generally, these time-weighted averages are not going to be super applicable for emergency operations.
Then we have the recommended exposure limit for the short-term exposure limit. So this is that short 15-minute recommended exposure limit. It's used very similar to the PEL STEL, but it's, again, more protective, so it's a lower level.
Yeah, and then now we're back down to the recommended exposure ceiling. Same kind of concept as the last one. We're not going to go over this thing. Same thing, right? If we hit this, we're out. We can use this to set alarm levels, recognize that we have an acutely toxic inhalation hazard in the moment.
Now, the next one is an easy one because this is probably the big daddy of all of them is the ideal H, which is like our, I don't know. This is the one where you're actually, it's game time, right? So the immediately dangerous to life or health, and this is put out by NIOSH. The official definition is that their airborne concentration poses an immediate threat to life, irreversible health effects, and the impairment would prevent escape within 30 minutes. And I believe it also says something in there about not having gear on.
Yeah. And so an industrial hygienist might use this to do respiratory selection, determining whether or not an SCBA is required. Right? We know we cannot use an air purifying respirator above the ideal H. So, right, that is a very limiting factor. If we know we are above the ideal H value, then we know we have to be bringing our own air to the party.
Yep. And for us as a hazmat technician, this is kind of like your bread and butter, like I was saying before. It's like, let's say you got some hydrogen sulfide in a confined space, like you're in a manhole or a ditch or something like that. If the meter's above the ideal H, first off, you need full SCBA, right? Because we've already hit the PEL before. And now we've determined you can't use filters. So you might have to do supplied air. You're definitely going to need a rapid intervention team, right?
Yeah, you're going to have to, because if we're on supplied air, we have to go back to 2 in, 2 out. And so this is also going to help influence are we in level A? Are we in level B? And then how long are we going to be inside? Especially when we watch that clock tick down on our supplied air supply, how long are we going to be in those spaces before we have to think about withdrawal? In that context, how many more people are we going to need to make this operation happen if we're going to have to be in and out as often as we are?
Nice job, Jake. Now it's going to take me all day to edit all these screw-ups you made.